This is Kick-Ass Politics. I'm Ben Mathis. If you're listening for the first time, this is a sample episode as part of the Kick-Ass Politics preview station. If you like what you hear, there are many more episodes to enjoy on our main podcast at Kick-Ass Politics. You can subscribe for free by going to Kick-Ass Politics on iTunes or go to the link on the information page for this episode. Also, feel free to check out our website for show notes, book recommendations, and more at kickasspolitics.com. And now, I hope you enjoyed this preview episode of Kick-Ass Politics. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Audible has over 180,000 audiobooks available to download for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And right now, Kick-Ass Politics listeners can get a free audiobook download and a free 30-day trial. Just go to audibletrial.com/kickasspolitics or click on the sponsor link on our webpage at kickasspolitics.com and go get your free audiobook. Hi, folks. I'm Ben Mathis, and welcome to Kick-Ass Politics. About a week ago, the U.S. Treasury Secretary announced that the Treasury is going to replace Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill with the face of a yet-to-be-named woman in American history. And it led me into getting into an interesting back and forth over Twitter with a guy named Bruce Carlson. He's the host of a very popular podcast called My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. And it's actually one of my favorite podcasts because he puts today's political events into historical perspective with a particular focus on American history. Well, I invited him on the podcast today, and in just a moment, you'll hear his perspective on the 2016 race, the many quirks of Lyndon Johnson, the decision to bump Alexander Hamilton from the 10, and a whole lot more. You don't want to miss this, so stay tuned.
From Hollywood to Washington, it's time for Kick-Ass Politics. And now here's your host, Ben Mathis.
My guest today is Bruce Carlson. He's the host of one of the most popular podcasts out there. It's called My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Bruce, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks, Ben. It's great to be on.
You have been at this whole podcasting thing for a while. You've been at this since, I think, 2006. So
that's right.
You're like the Philo Farnsworth of podcasting, and I'm kind of a little late, relatively late in the game here.
Yeah, 2006 was kind of the pioneer days, and I was using a Radio Shack microphone at one point. And, it's really evolved, and it's spiked up because of the use of cell phones now. And
right.
to view the cast, and there's a lot more interest in it than there had been.
I guess it's about 2 years ago I first got hooked on listening to podcasts, long before starting my own. And yours was one of the first for me. I'm a huge history nut and fairly involved politically, so it was right up my alley. I guess as a fan and a listener, my elevator pitch for My History would be: you take political events of the day and you put them into historical context with kind of the takeaway perhaps being, relax, there's nothing new under the sun. We've been through worse. Everything's going to be just fine. Was that your intent when you started this podcast?
It does end up happening in so many cases that the first discovery is this is the first time this has happened. And don't think at the time of 1776 that we know, just because they had a little powder in their hair doesn't mean that politics was different. Doesn't mean they didn't know about things like triangulation or other political concepts, electability, or concepts that we know today. In some ways it shouldn't be so shocking, but it is, perhaps because there isn't as much historical knowledge, particularly about the history of politics, as there could be. So, and also because the news media presents everything as breaking news. It's all current. It's happening now, and you don't get a lot of history on TV, and that's still a major source for a lot of people where they get the political information from.
Well, yeah, and it does seem like we're always in this constant state of crisis where one side or the other or both sides are screaming the sky is falling like Chicken Little. And, no matter what it is, whatever's going on is unprecedented. America has never been in greater danger than it is right at this very moment. Does that drive you up a wall when you hear that? Is there a part of you that just wants to slap someone across the face and say, get a hold of yourself, man?
Well, I'm always a man of peace, but I tell you, I think about that, and I say that when you think about the early American capital on Philadelphia, which was the most vulnerable harbor, which could be easily blockaded, and the city perhaps captured by either a French, British, or Spanish fleet, you pick, all of which would have been bigger than any American Navy at the time, and this is after independence. And you think about the threat to the nations at that time, and then when our two largest rivals/friends, rivals/trading partners, Britain and France, go to war, and during the second term of the Washington administration, after the French Revolution, and the threat that posed to the early nation, and you compare it to some of the threats that we talk about today, and more recently, when you even thinking about the Cold War, which I'm old enough to remember some of, maybe at least the tail end of, and the absolute threat of two nations with missiles pointed at each other, and you compare it to today, and it's not that I'm not taking the threats to the United States or other Western nations and allies seriously, but when you think about some of the historical times, it was pretty scary too. And that influenced the decisions that many presidents had to make. If we're talking about Kennedy, we're talking about Ford, we're talking about Reagan, they all were Cold War presidents. And it was a very dangerous time. We've almost, Cold War's over, 92, we move beyond it, well.
Yeah, I have to ask, in the 9 years or so that you've been doing My History Beats Up Your Politics, has there ever been an event since you've been doing the show that stumped you where you just thought, whoa, that's never happened before?
Oh, I think that things are always a little different. And one of the points I always make in this program is there's always a future, and there's always the ability of surprise, and elections are still fun, and elections still can be spontaneous, even if I can kind of point out that, it does seem to happen that when there's a midterm in the president's first term, whoever is in the White House, the president's party loses seats. Now, is this coincidence? There must be a pattern there, and you can kind of predict it. And since I've been doing the program, no surprise there. We had 2006 right when I started the program, which was predicted to be a big defeat for the Bush administration. And then you had 2010, first term Obama, which was predicted to be a big defeat for Obama's administration. Then again in 2014, easy pattern to predict. So you have things like that. And, you have some interesting events that seem to happen. I mean, despite my love of history, I'm still I still love the spontaneous events of our politics, and I'm still surprised by things, and I still look forward to what's going to happen.
Well, you're right, though. It is still fun. I've given up on prognostication. I mean, pundits love to make definitive predictions as if, they're the great and powerful Oz or something and all-seeing, all-knowing. But, I think back to the last presidential election when Dick Morris famously predicted, even up to the very end, that Romney was going to have a landslide victory by, I think, 112 electoral votes, and he was going to carry Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Ohio and New Hampshire, and I don't think he didn't carry any of those. So I've kind of given up on declaring anyone inevitable or anyone politically dead at this point. As many second careers as I've seen. And every day in the media these days, the constant refrain is Hillary Clinton is inevitable for the Democrat nomination. And I think to myself, that's what everyone said 8 years ago. I mean, I guess my question to you then, Bruce, is do you see any scenario looking at the election that's going on right now in which Hillary somehow doesn't get the nomination? And is there some historical precedent for that?
I mean, there's It's funny, after all that buildup, my answer is probably not likely. So I haven't done a lot of justice to what you just said. But I think it's likely that she'll get it for a couple of reasons. Could be an upset. And here's the two scenarios that I think would be scary for Hillary Clinton running in the Democratic nomination: African-American candidate, Hispanic candidate. Right now, not in the race. Right now, the opponent she has is a very liberal candidate. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders, who I think is the larger challenge from the left and is starting to gather some crowds. If you're Hillary Clinton, you want an opponent like Bernie Sanders, because you're going to be, the best politics is don't look at me, don't look at me, look at that man that's in the tree. And you want to point to someone else who's more left or more liberal than you are when it comes time for that general election. Now, in a primary, he might cause a little damage. I would expect to be surprised, okay, in New Hampshire and or Iowa. I think one or the other of those is either going to be a large upset, say like Bernie Sanders in either one of those states.
Okay.
Now, you have the precedent of 1968, where in New Hampshire, Lyndon Johnson won that primary, and that's something that's forgotten. He won that primary, and then he left the race. And he won the primary by 8 points. This would be, in today's era, an enormous victory for the incumbent president of the United States. But because he was expected to win by more, he dropped out. And all other sorts of things happened. This year, it's harder and harder. I mean, in today's politics, it's harder and harder to execute that kind of the same surprise. 8 points? Hillary Clinton wins by 8 points in either place? That's a huge victory these days. So the standard for what an upset is has increased. Somebody really has to shock, maybe even win one of these primaries to really shock the Clinton campaign. If that happens, I think history has shown, and recent history has shown, that you enter a little bit of a downward cycle as a front-runner candidate then, and the challenger starts gaining momentum. But you know what? The recent history has also been that there's a limited gain from that. If you look at Gary Hart surprising Mondale, you look at Buchanan surprising Bush, these events in New Hampshire, McCain winning in 2000, has had less.
Or just the last time around, too. The Republican primary, we had a different front runner, I think, every week in the Republican primary last time.
Yeah, I mean that, and you were asking earlier about one of those events that sort of surprised a little, and I thought that did. The different front runner every week was kind of interesting, surprising. Newt Gingrich had a turn. Herman Cain was a fairly surprising front runner for a small time there. But there's been many times.
Yeah, even Santorum got his due at one point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's been many occasions where parties have had kind of a very narrow field. I was looking recently, 1976, and were almost 13 candidates for the Democratic Party nomination. So I'm hearing all this talk now about it's the new fundraising, it's the new internet campaigning. It's because people now want attention that they never did that before. No one ever ran for president before just to get attention, or maybe to get a VP spot or a cabinet spot. There were 13 people running in 76, and there was no one that was immediately rise to the top. Carter exploited that in a manner of a political presidential primary history that still to this day, love or hate Jimmy Carter, many people on both sides will imitate his primary party strategy. And they're in Iowa now.
Have you found that it's in any way changed your political views when you dig into the history, and has it tempered any of your biases in some way?
Oh, absolutely. I think you lose that feeling of, it's going to be a disaster if this guy gets in, or, I hate this guy, or there are situations, or certainly political decisions I didn't like or did like, but I look at the situation and say, well, there's a limited range of what a president can do. In 2009, when President Obama took office, I was shaking my head at what people thought the president did, because I think they expected more from the presidency, that a president could do more, could wave a magic wand. For me, there's no magic wand. So I get less disappointed and less interested in whether this person's president or that person's president.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, well, I always get upset whenever my friends say, oh, well, if this guy gets elected, I'm moving to Canada. I mean, I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not. This is still the best deal out there. So it doesn't matter who gets elected. You're not going anywhere. So
it's not like everyone in Canada loves Stephen Harper either, or Justin Trudeau or any of them. Yeah. I think many. Yeah,
where do they go when they get upset? Where do they go to if they lose an election? Well, I'm curious, do you ever get any not angry fans, but I'm sure you get a lot of emails. Do you ever get people who read some kind of political bent into one of your podcasts, or start going off and say, you're a socialist, or you must be a Tea Party, or do you ever get any of that?
I don't get as much as you might think. I don't get as much as I even expected. The issues where there's more, anything with Israel, anything involving the Second Amendment, anything involving a specific bill like Obamacare while it was being passed, and both with people on the left and the right on that particular issue. Anything involving the media, or whether particular media outlets, say Fox News, MSNBC, are biased or not. Those are the type of things that flare up a bit, as can be expected. But I think we still have reasonable discussions on almost everything, including the Second Amendment and Israel, without getting too much of
I agree.
What you're talking about.
I think you keep it very even-handed. Your episode, I think it was a 2 or 3 part that you did on the history of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, I thought was terrific, and really put everything that's gone on between Bibi Netanyahu and Obama into context.
Well, because my real goal, and I appreciate you saying that, my real goal is, when I say history, my history can beat up your politics. And once in a while, I'll get somebody who thinks I want to step in the ring with them or something and answer a bunch of trivia questions. But I never started it as a person with all this knowledge, and I can beat up your knowledge like a history teacher. And I think that my goal is to beat up your politics. In other words, the fixed politics, the unthinking politics and ideology that someone might have, left, right, middle, etc. My larger goal is, I think if we have people with better information, they're more cognizant of the history and the context, that we'll have a better politics.
I agree. I think you do a real service there by giving people some kind of context and helping people make perhaps more informed decisions. Well, we'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll have a little bit of a lightning round of political history with Bruce Carlson. Back in just a moment. This portion of the podcast is sponsored by Fiverr. You've heard me rave about Fiverr before. That's Fiverr with 2 R's. Fiverr is the world's largest online marketplace for services with over 100 categories, all offered for a fixed base price of just $5. Logo design, business consulting, marketing, business cards and stationery, web design, translation, proofreading, legal consulting, and just about any other service you can possibly imagine, all offered at a base price of just $5. In fact, you know the announcer who does our intro on Kick-Ass Politics? I found him on Fiverr. A professional radio announcer to do our intro for just $5. And right now, when you go to Kick-Ass Politics and click on the Fiverr ad on our sponsor page, you'll be showing your support for the show, and you'll get some great offers on services tailored to your needs. Whatever you need done, find it on Fiverr. And if you like Kick-Ass Politics and want to help keep us on the air, then please support the show by making a donation to our GoFundMe campaign at gofundme.com/kickasspolitics, or go to the show website and click on the donate link. Your support will help keep us producing new and even more interesting programs in the future. That's gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. And now, back to the show. We're back, and I'm talking with Bruce Carlson, host of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I want to cover some of the highlights of your best shows and a few of my favorite topics that you've covered over the years. But first I have to ask you about the $10 bill. In case anyone doesn't know, the Treasury Secretary announced that they're going to replace Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill with a yet-to-be-named female figure in American history to be determined at a later date. I guess people can vote for their favorite choice. So, Bruce, what do you think about giving old Al Hamilton the boot?
Well, I mean, the guy creates the banking system in the United States as we know it, at least after the Constitution, and this is how we treat him, Yeah. I mean, I found it to be interesting and funny that it happened this way. The more I thought about it, I'm not surprised, and I think there are some politics surprise, because the more I think about it, they picked the individual that was the easiest target. I mean, first of all, he's a member of the Federalist Party, which doesn't exist anymore. There's no, as far as I know.
He has no lobby out there for him.
I mean, they're restarting the Whig Party these days, but I'm not sure the Federalists even have an office in D.C. These days. And I also figured that if they went to Jackson, if they went to Jefferson, I think for the Obama administration to do that, they probably would have received a lot of criticism because of the choice, because it would have been seen like picking someone who, the old Scots-Irish, you're not in your political base normally. If anything, you can say in a lot of issues Hamilton was more left, and he represented that side. So I think it was easier to remove him. Plus, he did have that little scandal in office, with the adultery. So maybe that's part of it too. I don't know why they don't just simply consider new denominations.
If $75 bill.
Well, I think with the inflation over time, even the natural inflation that occurs, that new denominations could be useful. 25, and especially if there's more figures to honor. For instance, I do think that Harriet Tubman would be a great choice to put on one of these bills. Represents a lot of groups that we want to show respect for.
Right.
Also, just a really tough lady, had a really good story, a hero, somebody who probably rescued 70 to 100 slaves and did it in a very risked her life. Then was a spy for the Union Army. I mean, so I think that she's a good candidate for a space. I just don't know. I do worry a little bit as a history guy about taking one of those figures like Alexander Hamilton off. You take him off the $10 bill, and do we remember Hamilton?
I guess my problem with it is the idea of, instead of picking a candidate among all candidates, all Americans, who we feel made the biggest contribution to America, we're choosing to honor a certain group first and then narrowing it down from that group, as opposed to considering, I don't know, Thomas Edison or Theodore Roosevelt and throwing everyone into the same group and then picking someone. But
yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I actually like Tubman, because I think there's some generic qualities there that are beyond just her representing African Americans and women, and also real tough cookie, real tough character, hero, and did service in a United States Army while not directly fighting.
I wouldn't mind if every time I opened my wallet I saw Scarlett Johansson, but
I mean, I'm an audio guy, so for me the memorable performance of her was in Her, where she did a really good job with the voice.
Yeah, she sure did. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've listened to you for a while, and I can't tell if you respect him or not, but I do think that you have a certain, maybe amused affection for Lyndon Johnson. There are many of my listeners who probably have no idea what the so-called LBJ treatment or the Johnson treatment was. Can you walk them through that and give them the gist of what that might entail?
If you were a senator and he needed your vote, he was going to get your vote. His face was going to be in your nose, in your throat, until he got your vote. He would yell at you, but you know what? There are some people who say, that wouldn't work with me. When someone yells at me, I'm twice as determined not to vote for him. Oh, he knew that too. He knew just how to play you. If you were that type of person, you'd get the best compliment. You'd get the pat on the back that you don't get from anybody else. you'd get all of these things. So I think that he was definitely he knew how to cajole. He knew how to get votes. He was a guy who became minority leader and then majority leader, one of the youngest people to do that in his 40s. I forget the exact age, but very young at the time. And it was because he was so good. And as president, he went right into that mode. And when you think about it, I do admire him on a couple of things. And then also I think he was probably a horrible person to deal with, and he had some really bad qualities too, like so many presidents and politicians. But what I do admire about him, so rare among our presidents, that you have somebody who's a good Washington operator. Now, why is that? Because we don't like to vote for him.
Yeah.
Didn't have to vote for Lyndon Johnson. In fact, he did everything almost to avoid running for president while he did actually run for president. He avoided the big public spectacle of running for president, so it appears, so they wouldn't fail. I mean, that seems to be what's thought.
One time I remember you said that you could probably do a whole podcast on LBJ stories. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, yeah. I just love the idea of him campaigning when the helicopter was something that didn't appear in World War II. We didn't have them yet.
Yeah.
And by his 1948 Senate campaign, he's already got one. And he's flying around these little Texas towns. And, you look up in the sky, you're working on a tractor or something, and you look up, and can you imagine it? You've never seen anything like it. The country hasn't seen anything like this type of aircraft that can hover over. And there, with a megaphone, is Lyndon Johnson out the window of the helicopter, please vote for me for Senate. I just think that had to be a fascinating sight.
Yeah, that's a very Texan move there.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I'm sure, of course, I imagine you've probably heard the LBJ tapes of when LBJ orders a pair of pants. So I won't go into that, but folks can Google that if they want.
Well, that reminds me of a good one where he in the same series of phone calls, most of them are on YouTube. So the Michael Betschloss has a good collection of them in his audiobook. But there's a great one where he asks for a free haircut. President of the United States, but he said, "Look, I got wives and children to support." And I'd really, if you can do me this favor. Oh, sir, there'll be no charge for this. Oh, that's great. And then he says to him, you know what? Franklin Roosevelt said a man can have anything if he wants if he knows how to keep his mouth shut. Oh, Mr. President, certainly I won't tell anybody about this. So if he's doing that to the haircut guy, you can imagine what he's doing to senators.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because, Nixon had voice activated recorders, but LBJ had to tell his secretary every time he wanted to record something. So I'm just trying to picture him saying to his secretary, you're going to want to get this, darling. Turn on the recorder. I'm going to order a pair of pants. Well, while we're still on that era, Nixon versus Kennedy. Was television really Richard Nixon's undoing?
Obviously, it was not a good moment for the Nixon campaign, and it certainly helped Kennedy. I still think there are some circumstances where Kennedy was still probably going to win that election by the very slight margin that he did. People vote for president based on the performance of the incumbent party. There was some stagnation. There were some concerns about the battle with the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower administration seemed lethargic. They liked Eisenhower personally, but I believe we're concerned about Nixon. The largest factor in that election, and this is telling for 2016, just like it is for 2008, in my opinion, was the anemic support that Eisenhower gave and that Nixon sought from Eisenhower. Just like in 1999 and 2000, Gore did not utilize Clinton. Now, there are obviously some reasons for that. They were very concerned. I remember talking to a guy in helping to run Gore's Tennessee campaign in 2000. Very concerned about bringing the president in there and then try and have Gore as a candidate appeal family values, So there were some tough things. I still think you can't run from an incumbent president, whatever the circumstances are. You can try. Nobody's done it successfully. You're not going to win. And I think that they were lethargic in the use of Eisenhower during that campaign, and that hurt.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that Hillary or whoever the Democratic nominee should be concerned about, whether they like it or not. They're running on the Obama administration's record. That's always the way it is and always the way it will be.
92, did Ross Perot cost George H.W. Bush the election?
I don't think so. Clinton was leading with 50% of the vote in a lot of polls in October before the point that Perot had jumped back into the race. Elections are always about the performance of the incumbent. It might not have been the worst recession, but it was a scary one for people who hadn't encountered a lot of them before.
One of the things that I've picked up on in listening to your podcast is that you enjoy getting lost down the rabbit hole of the great what-ifs in history. And I have to say, as a listener, it's very fun to go on that journey with you. What is your favorite what-if in American history?
Gosh, I can never just do one. So I'll throw out a couple of them quickly. But one is what we were just talking about. What if Perot had run a real campaign?
Yeah.
And as about the only third-party presidential candidate I can think of that might have achieved it, what if he became president? That would have been so interesting. But I do think, given his personality, the fact that he jumped out of the race, seemed a little unstable, he wasn't going to do it. But if those factors weren't present, what if we had a President Perot? How different would our politics be? What about Theodore Roosevelt in the 1912 election? There's so many what ifs. You'd love to see what happens. John F. Kennedy not assassinated, of course. What would have come there? I think he wins in 1964. I think he wins big over Goldwater or Rockefeller, one of them. And I think that he's able to enact his own agenda instead of having LBJ kind of enact his agenda. What would we think of him now? Instead of being seen as a martyr hero, he's just one of many presidents. You either love him or you hate him. So many. McCain becomes president in 2000.
Yeah.
So many to think about.
Well, I mean, let's say had Lincoln not gotten elected, do you think we still would have had a civil war?
Absolutely. Well, particularly if it would have been Seward, it might have been faster and worse. I don't think that would have been his campaign slogan or anything. Yeah.
So you're saying we got off easy
I think,
with the Civil War we got. Oh, okay.
I think we did. I mean, another interesting to take it to a world stage, but it affects America. What if Britain had not entered World War II in the same way? World War II became more of a Nazi versus Russian fight. And what would have been the effect on America if we were never that large world power and Britain retained its gold reserves and didn't have to ship them over here? Here's another good one. John Adams gets a second term. Jefferson is not president. Does he even run in 1804? He almost, Jefferson wins the 1796 election and becomes the successor to Washington instead of the third president. All of these things are fascinating. This is too good. You can't say you could just have one cookie, Bruce.
Yeah, exactly. Or Woodrow Wilson doesn't get elected. Do we have a League of Nations, a Versailles Treaty, a World War II? Who's to say?
I think it's fascinating to see if it's either Taft or in that case Roosevelt would have been in the second position in that election. If it's Roosevelt, what does he do with World War I? And afraid to say, I almost know the answer. That believe we would have entered faster at the cost of greater bloodshed. So it's an example where we all love Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm fascinated by him like everyone else. Did a lot of great things. Wrong time for him to be president.
Well, I know you have to go, but we'll kind of do a lightning round here of just a wrap up of the bests and worsts here. Okay, Aaron Burr, worse than Hitler or completely misunderstood?
Oh, well, we don't get into Goodwood's law there. I don't, little bit understood, but not as much as some of the modern history books would have you think. He's a politician, and he's probably one of the worst, in quotes, politicians of that time. It doesn't make him as evil as he might seem in a lot of accounts, but he was a manipulator.
Okay. Dirtiest election in American history.
1876. I'll go with the standard answer. Pretty bad for on both sides, by the way. I think it was totally wrong that the way those three states electoral votes got shifted to the Republicans. But what the Democrats did in the South in intimidating African American voters was just as wrong. So on both sides, a pretty nasty, dirty election. And then, of course, you had at that time in the cities, you would have had New York and other cities where votes were just bought. But I can't just have one. 1888, pretty bad as well, where literally votes in Indiana were just going to the highest bidder. And in 1888, the Benjamin Harrison campaign just had more money to spend. And they were bringing votes in from Illinois and other states, to vote in Indiana.
How about this? Worst Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott?
Obviously, Dred Scott, if you take that out, Plessy, I think these are the stains in our history and stains on the judicial system.
Favorite founding father?
James Madison. Interesting guy, great mind, represents while other founders kind of represent maybe one side of the spectrum or the other, I think James Madison is so interesting because he represents the dilemmas that we have in politics today between reasonably minded people trying to solve problems. That's what he was at his time. He was partisan at times. He was loved by all people at different times. He was a great thinker, and he was a divided mind.
So how about then most underrated president ever?
I've been defending Wilson a lot lately. I think, in among modern viewers, it's like, well, he's just a racist. I don't want to pay attention to him at all. And it's true. Like, unfortunately, so many people at the time period we're talking about when he was president and before, the racial views in the country were abhorrent in general. However, some of the things that he achieved as president, I think, and his ability to move Congress. He was the one outsider president who it kind of worked for him. He came in and he would enter the hall of Congress, and people and presidents hadn't done that for a very long time, 100 years, and now they enter all the time. But he made the first State of the Union speech since Thomas Jefferson stopped doing that and set that precedent. He came to Congress and spoke for his tariff bill, solved a huge problem, and he knew how to get things done with Congress. Didn't get his League of Nations passed, but it was a good idea for the world to start talking, and he got that going. And that's why I think that you still hear Wilson's name in a lot of the accounts of presidents in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s when people are thinking about great presidents. And then the other underrated, because I'm having trouble naming just one with all of these, but yeah. James Monroe.
Oh, okay.
James Monroe. One of the most popular presidents ever, the guy that really came the closest to unifying the country and balancing all sides of the political spectrum. Very important moment for the country as we moved from what some call the Second War of Independence, the War of 1812, established the country firmly and set our place in the world as the defender of the Latin American nations and
right.
defending their independence that they were just earning during his time, and the United States had to make a decision about that. Fully developed, negotiated a great treaty with Spain under his administration. It was John Quincy Adams that did the treaty that enlarged America and got Florida under our control. So it kind of got the right balance between what federal government does, what it doesn't do. Had to deal with Henry Clay as Speaker. You think Boehner's tough?
Yeah, I don't doubt that. Well, I feel kind of cruel for then throwing this out as the last question because you could probably go on for 3 hours, but worst president?
No, I go right in line with the standard books on it. You got to put James Buchanan there. And I'll tell you why. It goes to show you about the American mind. The reason I think James Buchanan shows up on most list as the worst president is because his crime was inaction. And one of the things generally about Americans, it's almost been true throughout our history, even as our demographics and our population and economy or place in the world changes, is we like action. During the Constitutional Convention, they wanted the presidency to be an engaged person, a lot of the rules about the president, that the fact that they can run for re-election is because they didn't want somebody saying, well, I'm just going to wait this out. They wanted to give them, they wanted somebody with energy and dispatch. Those were the words used. So when you have Buchanan, it's like, they're seizing some federal forts. Well, cabinet, what should I do? Or I'll wait for the next guy to get in here. That was the biggest crime, and that's why I think that people of all colors kind of put him as the worst president ever. But I'll also make another surprising choice. James Madison. No, I just said he was one of my favorite people. Wrong job for him. First of all, we kind of slid into the War of 1812, and then once it happened and there were troops around Washington, he was a horrible commander-in-chief. Nearly didn't get reelected at a time when it really should have been easy for presidents, especially from Virginia, to win every election. Nearly didn't get reelected because I think there was a lot of animosity even in his own party about him, and the Republicans split throughout the country in 1812. So, when Washington burns on your watch, one of your, not so good presidents, not the worst, of course. But
it just goes to show that not every founding father has to make a great president necessarily. So,
right.
Bruce, I'm a big fan of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I appreciate you coming on, and I recommend that anyone that's listening look it up on iTunes. It's My History Can Beat Up Your Politics with Bruce Carlson, and download a few episodes, give it a try, and I think you'll get hooked. I definitely did. Well, Bruce, thanks so much for joining me. It's been a lot of fun.
Ben, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Bruce Carlson for coming on the show. This was actually a big treat for me because I've been a big fan of his podcast for 2 years now. I highly recommend it. You can go to myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com or subscribe to My History Can Beat Up Your Politics on iTunes. It really is one of my personal favorites, and if you like some of the stuff that we cover on this show, then you'll go nuts for Bruce's podcast. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast on iTunes so you can automatically get new episodes as they become available. And while you're there, I'd appreciate it if you left us a review. That helps a lot with the show's rankings on iTunes. And if you like Kick-Ass Politics and want to help keep us on the air, then please support the show by making a donation to our GoFundMe campaign at gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. Or go to the show website and click on the donate link. Your support will help keep the lights on over here and will be greatly appreciated. That's gofundme.com/kickasspolitics. For now, though, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass Politics. Kick-Ass Politics is a trademark of Mathis Entertainment, Inc.